First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and also to clarify that my talk is really not an empirical topic in nationalism studies. So I'm a political philosopher. So I'm interested in ideas connected to nationalism, some of the ideas that connected with the previous speaker, also the state, community, identity, and territory. So today I'd like to talk about territory, which is the topic of a book I wrote in 2015, but it's a topic that's a large topic. In fact, when I was writing the book, I thought that it turned out that it was about too many things. It would take up the whole of political philosophy. So in some sense, I'm still working on territory. And it's an important topic because most people that talk about the state or theorize the state are interested in the relationship between the state and citizens. So what obligations do citizens have to the state? What entitlements do citizens have? But the state isn't just a membership organization. It has a territory, a geographical domain. And that is less clearly theorized. And it's less clearly theorized, especially normatively, right? So we have an historical idea, like that places conquered territory or left with territory or they contracted from power. But the question is, but we don't just need a descriptive theory about how people conquered places, but I want to suggest that we need a normative theory about what entitlements people might have to place. And in part, that's just clear we need some kind of a normative theory because sometimes different claims are made for the entitlements to territory, contested territory, entitlements connected to territory. Like resource rights in a place, and it would be, and when there's these, and when it's unclear, and there's secession cases too, which is a claim to territory. So we would need to have a theory about what kinds of entitlements make sense. So I sort of discussed why we need a theory of territory there. But I will go back to that in a minute. So what I want to explain is why we need it. So I've sort of indicated why we need a theory of territory. And I just wanted to say that a theory of territory, I take it, is a theory of the appropriate, normatively defensible relationship between the state, the people, and land. And all the theories of territory out there all have those three elements in a triangular relationship. So there's the state, the people, and land. And there's different configurations, but that's what a theory of territory is. So now I wanted to ask, well, that's fine. What is territory? Anyway, can't have a theory of territory without knowing what territory is. So territory, as I understand it, and I think this is pretty clear in the literature, is the geographical domain of political or jurisdictional authority. So it's a political concept. So we shouldn't think of territory as land. It's distinct from land. Land, I take it, is the part of the Earth's surface that is not covered by water. And of course, we often talk about land, but as if it's the same as territory, because most land is claimed by a state, and so is also territory. But there could be unclaimed land. There could be land that's unclear whose territory it is. That is, it's contested between two states. And also, territory extends beyond land. The territorial extent of the state goes to the airspace above the land. It also, states claim all the rights on the land all the way down to the middle of the Earth's surface, the middle of the core of the Earth. They're claiming resources deep down in the Earth. And they also are claiming territory in the sea offshore. So territory extends beyond land. So territory isn't the same as land. And it's also distinct from property. So I take it property, I looked up different definitions of property, but property we normally understand as a cluster of claim rights, liberties, powers, and immunities that when they're held together with respect to a particular thing, represent a form of ownership. There's different accounts of ownership, but that's kind of a general definition. So for most theorists, I think, except libertarian theorists, but for most theorists, jurisdictional rights, that is the state's rights to jurisdiction, conceptually precede property rights. And what I mean by this is we have a state, and the state defines the rules around property. They define what the property relations are that are legal in the state. The state tells us the rules around acquisition, transfer, and the like. So you need to know what the state is and the state's territory before we get to property. So now I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the problems that we would hope a theory of territory would be able to solve. So some people might object. I'm anticipating objections. Is a political theory of territory necessary, really? After all, in the current interstate order, all states by definition have territory. So in the 1933 Montevidean Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, which is the kind of standard international law convention, so right at the beginning in Article 1, having territory is definitional of states. States are defined, and this is as entities with fixed territories. So I emphasize with fixed territories and permanent populations under government control and with the capacity to enter into relations with other states. That's the quote. So if having territory is definitional of the states, why not just justify states and in the process justify their possession of territory as necessary to fulfill state functions? That's a question. And this has been the dominant attitude to the issue of territory. I think it's in international relations, international law, political science, political philosophy, and I think it's why it is under-theorized, why there hasn't been much attention given to it. But I want to claim that it's inadequate for two reasons. First, territorial statehood requires a defense. The existence of territorially ordered states should not be assumed as part of the natural order of the world, but it comes at a cost. In particular, the division of the world into distinct territorial entities is challenged by a kind of powerful and persuasive cosmopolitan idea that borders and territory are inimical to the moral equality of all human beings. And I think there's really two features of the territorial state that cosmopolitans typically object to. First, they object to rights to control resources within the jurisdiction of the state. And second, they object usually to rights to regulate borders. So what they say about resources is, look, resources really should be conceived of as part of the common stock of mankind. And exclusive control by the territorial state is unjustified. The bounty of the earth should be used to benefit everyone. So we need a good argument for why states have control of territory, and part of that control of territory involves resources. State control of borders, and here we're really talking about migration, is criticized too on cosmopolitan grounds, that it violates individuals' rights to free movement and equality of opportunity. And so if we're going to have an understanding of the state and its territory, where these are part of the rights over territory, we need an argument that explains whether these claims are justified and actually the scope of these justifications. Because even if they're justified, they might not be justified to the full extent. So that's one criticism that's made of the territorial state. And then more practically, maybe less philosophically, some argue that the territorial state is an outmoded form of organization. And here the thought is, well, the world is becoming more interdependent. This maybe made sense more before COVID, when we all shut down our borders. But in general, the world is interdependent, which is shown by the pandemic in some ways. And world problems require global responses. And these global responses cannot be affected by a system of independent territorial states. And this is true of human-induced global climate change, environmental degradation generally. It's poverty, which is exacerbated by global capitalism and a race to the bottom on the part of competing territorial jurisdiction. Some other global problems are international crime and terrorism. And so all these problems look like they require a global response. So on both the philosophical level and the practical level, we need to turn our attention to what could possibly defend the territorial state, if it can be defended, and if it can, what precisely can be defended. So the usual defense, so those are the reasons why we need a defense, and the usual defense of a territorial state appeals to the functions that it performs. And I believe that there are these benefits. There are obvious benefits to be had from the state applying uniform laws and common policies to people living in a proximity to one another, regardless of their status or identity. The territorial state, its defenders may claim, and here I actually believe this too, so I count as partial defender, is essential to the realization of equal freedom, equality before the law, predictability, and social justice. But this argument is not adequate because while it defends a territorial state system, it doesn't defend the precise territory or domain of the state. It tells us that the state ought to be ordered territorially, that there's good reasons to think about ordering it territorially rather than just in terms of membership, but it doesn't tell us where that state's territory ought to be. And many of the questions or concerns in the international order are about whose territory, who gets what. And to answer this question, which is usually called the particularity question, we need to connect particular states with particular geographical areas. This is necessary to address territorial conflicts, such as when two or more states claim the same piece of land, or in the case of secession, to define the boundaries of the seceding unit, or to sort out claims to the seabed or the high Arctic or the Antarctic. And I want to say here that because some of these places are unoccupied, the rules might be different. But all of these require us to think about the principles on which boundaries should be drawn. So, of course, nationalists, I said that the idea of territory and land has been under-theorized, but nationalists have theorized it. They have been the main people who have talked about this. They have an argument about land. I think it comes in different versions, but the political nationalist version, the one that is that each nation has a homeland. This is a place that is the birthright or cradle of the nation. Usually there's a claim that this area is imprinted with the culture of the people, and the nature of the place, its topography, climate, and so on, has affected the culture. So national groups are entitled to some particular place that is its homeland. I think in this version, this is not clearly, it's a little bit problematic. It is problematic, as I will explain. But I think there are some normative dimensions that we can tease out of this claim, this kind of argument, which I'll try to do. First, the claim is that this group, or each national group, has special entitlement to a particular place, or at least they have more entitlement than any other group. So the argument is a comparative argument. It's a comparative justification. It's saying we have a better claim than anybody else. And one dimension of the better claim is cultural. It's a relationship. It's connected to the relationship between the cultural group and the land, which confers entitlement. So what do we want to say about this? So one thought I had that if we were going to a new planet or something, or some place that's completely like just our blue planet without people on it, and we just had to make a decision about how to divide up the face of the earth, then the fact that a group cares more about a place or cares particularly about a place looks like it's a reason to give the group that place. But in itself, the idea that you care about the place doesn't seem like a strong argument. So we're going to have to make the argument stronger, we need to say something more. And I think that all the stronger justifications, and nationalists actually move between the stronger and weaker claims, but the stronger justifications are based on cases where, at least in the standard case, the group occupies or legitimately occupies a place. In English, occupancy is meaning to reside, to occupy a place, like to live in a place. And so occupancy is different from to occupy, where occupy often has a military idea. And here I only mean occupancy as in the sense of inhabit. So I just wanted to be clear about that. And the reason why the occupancy argument might be important is that, to the extent that the nationalist argument appeals to culture and to claiming that imprinting culture on a place gives some kind of entitlement, and often goes back to historic claims, is that it's very difficult to make sense of some historical claims as a kind of general point. So at one point, Hellenic culture spread all across the Mediterranean, down to Lebanon, present-day Israel, Egypt. But I don't think we think that Greece is entitled to all those places. So when that argument is stronger, it's when the people actually live in that place. So I think that what we can take from the nationalist claim is that the strongest defense involves when a group, I haven't explained what kind of group, but when a group lives in a place, has occupancy in a place, not just a cultural imprint on a place. So I'm going to move. So with that on deck, I want to just sidestep a little bit and then go back to that particular challenge. Can we then defend an international order comprised of territorially organized states? So what I want to do in the next two slides is sketch an account that can both address the particularist challenge, that is, justify not only the territorial system, but also attempt to attach individual states or government with individual land in a way which isn't nationalist, but which draws on what could be the strongest part of the a stronger but non-cultural part of the nationalist argument, and which is also justified. And in this case, I want to argue that it's justified on the grounds of the value of political self-determination. So there are two aspects to this argument, which is on the slide. One links the people with the land, and so responds to the particularist challenge. The second links the people with the value of political self-determination, and so justifies the political entity. So you can see, so that's the argument. And you can see here that what I'm doing is, I said at the very beginning that all theories of territory put three things into relationship: the state, the people, and land. So I'm linking people and land, and then I'm linking people in the state, and that's how I'm trying to develop the relationship between them. That's the thought. So to address the particularist challenge, which, remember, is the challenge of linking particular states with particular territories, I think the only way to do this is to examine the relationship between people and place. So I thought for a long time about this. I used to read poetry where people were extolling places and music, trying to get clear about what people were claiming, what the emotions they had, and also to think through what the possible relationships between people and place are. So this is a little bit complex, but what I'm going to try to do is to defend three kinds of place-related rights, some of which are held by individuals, some by groups, and the last one by institutions, the institution of some kind of state or sub-state entity that has self-determination rights. So rights of residency are held by individuals, rights of occupancy are held by groups, and territorial rights are held by political institutions. In all three cases, the rights are justified in terms of a deeper appeal to the fundamental interests of persons who have important relational and associative interests, which ought to be protected by individual or collective rights. And the conception of right that I'm relying on here is an interest-based conception, where the rights are conceived not as absolute claims, but as subject to limitations imposed by justice, and by which I mean essentially respect for rights of other kinds. So let me just talk a little bit about what those three place-related rights are, because I think we have to buy the idea that people have entitlement to place for this argument to get off the ground. So I'll start with the first one, the individual moral right of residency. I understand a moral right of residency as a right that belongs to individuals, and it involves first a kind of liberty. First, it's based on a kind of liberty right to settle in an unoccupied area. So if there's a place in the world that nobody lives in, you have a kind of liberty right to settle there. But this grounds the actual right, the moral right of occupancy, which I take it as a right of non-dispossession, a right to remain at liberty in one's own home and community and not to be removed from it. So I also argue as an extension of this right that it involves a right of return, that when an individual has been unjustly excluded from an area on which she or he has a right to reside, that person has a right to return. And there's lots of different kinds of arguments that are related to this, like that shows the kind of wrong of forced removal and why we. So let me move to a collective right of occupancy. So what justifies a collective right of occupancy? The basic idea here is that individuals have, in addition to individual identities, collective identities, which are integral to who they are. And many of these groups are attached to specific areas or specific bits of land, which form an important source of the collective identity and locus of people's lives. To make this argument, I appeal to empirical evidence, not only, I looked at Indigenous people in Canada who suffered from dislocation and social problems when they were removed from the areas to which they were attached. But also, I think that we have this idea with respect to other groups too, farmers, nomadic people, people living in distinctive local communities or neighborhoods, all of which have attachments to place, which ought to be recognized. So like residency rights, they give members of the occupancy group rights to remain in a place. But also, in addition, I want to argue rights to exercise some forms of local control over the geographical area on which the people live and on which they have a special interest. So also, before I move to the function that it serves, part of the reason I need that group-based claim about occupancy rights, in addition to just individual rights, is that when I said that the individual right was a right of non-expulsion, and it implied a right to return, that left the question, a right to return where? So when people have been excluded from a state, it's clear they have a right to return to the state. But in cases like Canada, where Indigenous people were removed from their area, the place where they lived, and they were sent, like in some cases, Labrador Inuit were sent to the high Arctic. They were already in Canada, but the right to return was a right to return to and maybe their homes were destroyed, to the collective area, the area that their group occupied and which was part of their collective identity. So you need an understanding of the collective moral right of occupancy, and the group may be actually the people in the state, but in order to give geographical determination to some of the individual residency rights, like say when a home is destroyed. But in this theory, so the function that occupancy rights don't only define the domain or area of individual residency rights, but they also solve the particularity problem for territorial rights. And so I argue that territorial rights, which are rights of jurisdiction and all the other rights that come with it, can only be held when the group in question has occupancy rights. And again, occupancy is more than just physical presence. It requires a stronger connection to land. The group must occupy the land legitimately and that's actually a difficult question, but at least in the first instance, let's just say they haven't displaced another group. And it must be rooted in that geographical space by the individual life plans and collective projects of the group's members. So to answer the particularity question, which is which state gets which area, is also answers the scope question. It helps to address the boundaries of the territory. It tells us where the state ought to hold territorial rights, where the group is has occupancy rights. I haven't explained what the group is yet. I will do that, but that's the thought there. So let me now turn to the justification for territorial rights, which are separate from these problems. So what I've done now is explained how land and people might be related in 3 different kinds of ways. But now we have to ask, well, what justifies territorial rights? And on this account, it's really my account, states, or not only states, but also sub-state units, like in Canada, provinces, but they have some kind of institutional mechanism to make collective choices. So states or sub-state units or trans-state units hold territorial rights by acting as a vehicle of self-determination for some group, and I call the group G. That just stands for group. So let me kind of analyze both aspects of this. What I mean by the value of self-determination, and then what kind of group can qualify as a potential vehicle for self-determination and therefore a potential source of territorial rights. So that's analytically what I'm going to do in the next 2 slides. So who is the self in the self-determining group is the question that I'm just about to ask. What kind of group can qualify as a potential bearer of territorial rights? There are a number of different possible groups. The state could be the bearer of territorial rights, or a cultural nationalist would say a cultural nation. But I'm going to argue here, and I've argued it in my book, so this part of it's pretty derived, is that it's a people defined politically. And the 3 conditions that I give for counting as a people, and this is a kind of concept we have in Rawls and in various different other kind of accounts. So the 3 conditions that I give are political identity, political capacity, and political history. And just to be clear about why I think, why I'm worried about the cultural nation, I said, well, it could be a cultural nation, but I think a cultural nation is problematic in different ways. And one kind of problem is that it may be exclusive to only that people who bear that culture within the domain of the state. And that's a kind of shorthand for what makes it a kind of problem. And it also, of course, has that boundary problem, which I mentioned earlier about the Hellenic, about Greece and the Hellenic areas historically. Some people might think it's a state, and in some sense, of course, the state is important to the territorial rights. So territorial rights are exercised by the state. But the question I'm asking now is, what is the self being self-determining through which they exercise self-determination through the institutions of the state. So my thought is that self-determination of a state isn't really that valuable. A state is just like a political entity. It's only valuable insofar as the people can exercise self-determination through the state. So that's the thought. And so it's the people, surely, I mean, in all accounts of popular sovereignty, that for whom there is value in exercising self-determination. So now I have to define the people, and I wanted to say that there are three conditions: political identity, political capacity, and political history. So the political identity condition requires that the group is united by a shared aspiration for wide-ranging powers of jurisdictional authority or political control over the territory. That's the idea behind the political identity condition. So I think that it's not, so my thought here was that it's not that we need a specific agreement on any particular question in order to function, in order to live together and share political institutions. We might disagree about whether vaccines should be required by law or whether vaccines should be encouraged. We might disagree about redistribution. We might disagree about about many different kinds of things and have a kind of an institutional mechanism to make those decisions. But what we do need is a kind of political identity where we feel that this is the right kind of, that we are in a relationship with a group of people with whom we want to have self-determination. So the political identity condition, so I think that that's what's necessary for the political identity condition, that at least there has to be an aspiration for wide-ranging powers of jurisdictional authority over the territory. And part of the reason I made it non-cultural as well is like I'm a Canadian, and Canadians aren't culturally that different from Americans, actually. Like if I'm in New York, I don't feel culturally that it's, it does feel different from being in Canada, but maybe no different than somebody from Idaho going to New York City. Okay. So it doesn't seem that culture is the main thing. What seems to me is that Canadians have their own political project. It's distinct from an American political project. We have different political, and we want to pursue that project separately from Americans. And that's the political identity condition. The political capacity requirement refers to predicted and or demonstrated ability to exercise self-determination and maintain effective forms of governance. We might struggle with this condition, because some of the reasons groups don't have capacity is because they've been oppressed. But the thought behind this the thought here is simply that it doesn't make sense to give to give the institutions of self-government to a group that's incapable of exercising self-government. And I'm happy to, if we have questions about that. And the third condition requires that the members of the group have a history of shared practices and mobilization in terms of political projects. And so the political history condition here isn't really is because this is a relational account. This is about people being in relationships with each other, these valuable relationships, and they seek to exercise self-determination. And if you're in a relationship, it's not episodic. It's not a thought that you might like to be friends with such a person. A relationship is ongoing and substantive interactions. So I think that if it's a relational account, it has to show some kind of ongoing history of shared practices. Actually, I'm just going to go back a little bit because I wondered if I'm missing a slide here. Nope. Okay, so I do want to maybe say a little bit about self-determination in addition, because I said that the value of that I should really talk about the value of self-determination, and I haven't really explained it. So after we talk about place-related rights, I said, well, actually, what are and what the group is, we might talk about the value here. And I think that the value of self-determination here, I'm just going to give a little bit of an account of what if the value is self-determination, and I've defined the self, we need to think about what self-determination is. And just to do it really quickly, and I should have made a slide. I think it's important and kind of distinct from Kantian theories of territory that the moral value of self-determination does not inhere in the fact that through it people create objective justice. That when they do, that's a good, it's an additional good. I think regimes ought to be just, but I don't think that the value for territory is justice. I think it's self-determination. I think if people have lived under an unjust regime, that is not a reason to strip them of their their institutions for self-determination. It's a reason to make sure that there's something done about that regime, maybe. Okay, so, and what I mean by self-determination is that people can realize goods through their relationships with one another, and one of those goods is collective self-determination. So it's an agency good. It's the idea that through the institutions of collective government, a people can co-create their own political project and realize and implement their own specific brands of justice and their own rules for organizing their collective lives. So the thought is that institutions of political self-determination give expression to the communities in which people live. They express people's identities. They're an important forum in which collective autonomy can be expressed, and people can shape the context in which they live and realize their political aspirations free of external domination. So the value, I think, in having territorially ordered entities is centrally the value of collective self-determination. Although I think that the governments of those entities also ought to be just, but I don't think that. But for territory, I think that the central value is that of collective autonomy, and collective autonomy is realized through institutional mechanisms such as a state or state-like structure, because only in that way can people make collective decisions over their lives. And but of course, collective autonomy can be realized through other collective entities too. But it's the thought that it's important for people, the group of people that have political identity, share a political identity, they have capacity, and they have a history of mobilization and relationships that show that they have shared practices and these shared desires, that those people are able to shape the broader canvas in which they make choices. Okay, so let me move forward. So the main argument then can be formulated as follows. When group G, that's just my word for a group, make it sound more analytical, which meets the three conditions that I just said above, when they legitimately occupy territory, T, understood as geographical space, they can be said to hold territorial rights over that space, and this is justified by the value of collective self-determination of the said group. That's really the main argument here. I could describe various ways in which that argument has implications for how we think about what the state is entitled to do. So if we think that there's value in collective self-determination, if self-determination is valuable, then the thought is it does justify some control over resources. So there is some resource rights there. Because it would be very difficult for a group to be self-determining if they couldn't have any control over the very land that they live, the water that they drink, rivers that they swim in, and so on. So having any robust rights of self-determination requires some control over the use of the resources in the area in which they live. That's the thought. And it also helps to explain some rights of control over borders. And here we're thinking about migration rights. And I think the thought here is that I'm not going to express this very well, but any particular migrant who wants to live peacefully in a country is in no way threatening that country's self-determination. They just want to be included. But it doesn't follow that millions of migrants who want to settle, like millions and millions, because we live in a very unequal world, wouldn't affect the capacity of that group to be self-determining, to make decisions about, building affordable housing relative to the population, education, healthcare, if there's no control over borders and migration. So I think that and so the idea that each individual migrant has an interest, I think, is absolutely right. And it's probably the case that lots of countries have much more capacity to include migrants before self-determination is affected. But there's a kind of fallacy of composition in thinking that just because no individual migrant poses a threat, it doesn't mean that millions of migrants pose a threat. And the fallacy of so I think that there's also, so not only are resource rights justified, I think rights over borders can be justified on the grounds of collective self-determination. And do I want to talk about some ambiguities in this account? I might leave it a little bit to questions, but I'll just suggest some ambiguities to the account. So I think that just like to reflect on some of the ways in which the account can solve some problems, and it solves other problems, but it doesn't actually solve them completely in the sense that that there's no indeterminacy. So, I mean, occupancy rights help us to think about how to draw boundaries, and that's an issue that's fraught, very problematic, not attempted by most political theorists who treat boundaries as purely arbitrary. And my claim is they're not purely arbitrary. I mean, setting aside the problem of wrongful taking of land, which actually does need to be dealt with, but I think separately, having non-wrongful occupancy of territory as a condition for a group to exercise rightful jurisdictional authority over the territory that is occupied does give you some conventions in boundaries, but it certainly tells you where the heartland of a group is, and also suggests that there are some areas that, like, that on a comparative justification, belong to a particular kind of group. When I say that there's still ambiguity, it's because in most places people are not settled evenly. They settle along oceans and rivers, so there could still be uninhabited areas, like a mountain or a rainforest. But I still think that it's sufficient on this argument that land is an integral part of the collective self-determination for the group to be an integral part of the way of life. It's not a subjective attachment only, like, oh, I like it. It's they have to argue that their way of life is bound up with access to and control over the area that where they live and they occupy it in the relevant sense. And the relevant sense here is that it represents the location of their aims and projects and is central to their way of life. So these considerations help us to fix a geographical domain, even ones that can include relatively uninhabited areas. But I actually spend, like in my book, I discuss Northern Ireland, Kashmir, and Kurdistan, where it's pretty clear that we have the need for power sharing arrangements to give effect to self-determination. I mean, territorial separation of groups is often not possible, but you can still, but even in a federal system, you would still need some territorial separation in order to realize equality before the law and so on. So that takes me to the end of my talk here on territory. So I think we can open it up for questions, and I don't know if the questions are directed at me or directed at all the previous speakers, but thank you very much, and I hope that was clear.